Let us step into a world where the Eastern Front never opened, where the vast, dark forests of Russia remained a mystery to the German soldier, and the summer of 1941 held its breath for a different kind of fury. In this world, the directive from the Wolf's Lair is not for panzer divisions to churn the soil of Belarusia, but for them to halt, to consolidate, to turn a conquering gaze westward across a narrower sea. The point of divergence is not a grand council or a sudden change of heart, but a slow, chilling calculus that settles over the high command like a winter fog in the spring of 1941. The sheer, incomprehensible scale of Russia, its notorious Rasputitsa, the season of mud, the ghost of Napoleon's Grande Armée whispering from history books, these factors weigh heavier in the balance. Intelligence reports, often dismissed in our timeline, of deeper Soviet reserves and stouter defenses, are given more credence. The allure of the Urals fades before the pressing, tangible reality of an unconquered Britain and an increasingly strained Mediterranean theater. And so, on a morning where the sun slants through the birch trees on what would have been the frontier, there is only the chatter of birds, not the metallic shriek of tank tracks. Operation Barbarossa remains a code name on a shelved plan, its pages slowly gathering dust in a Berlin safe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that cynical scrap of paper, is not torn asunder. It simply persists. And so the Wehrmacht digs in. Across the conquered territories of Europe, from the dunes of the Channel coast to the outskirts of Warsaw, a strange, grim stability descends. It is not peace, but a war placed on pause. The frenetic energy of blitzkrieg is channeled into the methodical work of occupation. Coastal defenses, which in our history were a desperate, late-war network, begin their rise in earnest now in 1941. Concrete is mixed and poured in endless gray rivers. Workers, conscripted from across the Reich's new empire, move like ants along the French and Norwegian shores, embedding steel dragons' teeth into the beaches, their shadows long in the cool northern light. The Atlantic Wall is not a last-ditch barrier, but a statement of permanent dominion, a sprawling, fortified border between the Nazi Festung Europa and the rest of the world. In Britain, the mood shifts from the desperate, defiant hope of 1940 to a grinding, existential dread. The Battle of Britain was won, but the war is not lost for Germany, it is merely transformed. Without the colossal drain of the Eastern Front, the Luftwaffe is not bled white over the skies of Stalingrad and Kursk. The relentless bombing of British cities, the Blitz, does not taper off, it evolves. It becomes more precise, more sustained, a tool of economic and psychological siege rather than a prelude to invasion. Nights in London are still spent in tube stations, the air thick with the smell of damp wool, cordite, and packed humanity. The sound is not of screaming Stukas, but of the deeper, heavier thump of bombers flying in disciplined, untouchable formations, their payloads falling with a terrible, predictable regularity. The hope for a second front, that shining prospect of relief pinned on a Soviet struggle, never emerges. America lends its aid, the convoys still braving the U-boat packs, but the prospect of a direct assault on the continent against a fully prepared, undivided German military seems a distant, bloody fantasy. Meanwhile, in the East, the silence is profound and deeply unnatural. The border between the German and Soviet spheres is a wound stitched shut with barbed wire and watchtowers. From a distance, sentries can see each other's breath in the winter air. Trade continues, a macabre ballet of necessity. Soviet trains heavy with grain, oil, and raw materials rumble westward as promised, while German machine tools and technical blueprints travel east. In smoky offices in Moscow, Stalin watches, his paranoia not ignited by sudden betrayal, but fed by the slow, dripping tap of this uneasy coexistence. The Soviet Union continues its frantic industrialization, its purges, but the catalyst for its incredible, brutal wartime mobilization, the existential threat of invasion, never comes. The Red Army remains a vast, unwieldy, and politically suspect force, its doctrines untested by the fiery forge of 1941. We come to know this world not through its generals, but through a ground-level story. Let us follow Anya, a young Polish woman from Łódź, now part of the Reichsgau Vortiland. In our history, her fate might have been a brief, tragic entry in a ledger. Here, it is different. With the war machine shifting to a long-term posture, the Nazi obsession with order and racial hierarchy hardens from genocidal frenzy into a cold, bureaucratic institution. The Holocaust does not accelerate into the industrial horror of the death camps. Instead, it metastasizes into a slower, more systematic process. Ghettos are not way stations to Treblinka, but become permanent, decaying cities within cities, their populations slowly dwindling from disease, starvation, and sporadic actions. Anya, deemed useful for her clerical skills and her fluency in German, is assigned not to a camp, but to a Verwaltungsbüro, an administrative office in Posen. Her days are a numbing litany of typing manifests, logging shipments of textiles from the ghetto workshops, and filing reports on population management. The evil she documents is no less absolute, but it is draped in the mundane. The scratch of her pen, the clatter of the typewriter keys, the smell of cheap paper and ink. She lives in a small, cold room allotted to auxiliary personnel, walking each day past buildings where the Polish names have been chiseled off and replaced with German ones. Her story is one of silent endurance, of witnessing the machinery of tyranny not in its explosive violence, but in its grinding daily application, wondering if this gray, airless reality is now the forever state of the world. Technologically, the path diverges. Without the desperate pressure of fighting a two-front war of attrition, German research progresses along different lines. The V2 rocket program, instead of being a terror weapon hurled at London in a futile late-war gesture, is refined with greater resources and time. By the mid-1940s, launch sites in France are not vulnerable, hurried installations, but hardened permanent facilities. The rockets become more reliable, their payloads potentially more sinister. Jet aircraft like the Me-262 enter service not as desperate interceptors to fend off Allied bombers, but as the spearhead of a new dominant Luftwaffe patrolling the skies of a fortress Europe. The atomic research program, fragmented and underfunded in our history, receives a more concerted, if no less chaotic, focus. The race is not against a collapsing war effort, but against a silent, reclusive Soviet rival and a besieged, stubborn Britain across the water. As the 1940s wear on, the world settles into a dreadful, frozen shape. Churchill's voice, still defiant, grows hoarse with exhaustion. The negotiated, uneasy stalemate with Britain eventually coalesces, not as a peace treaty, but as a cessation of major hostilities, an armed truce. The British Empire, bankrupt and isolated, turns inward, becoming a fortified island holding out against a hostile continent. The United States, its blood and treasure not spent on D-Day or the liberation of France, watches from across the Atlantic, a powerful but reluctant giant, its relationship with Europe defined by a wary armed cordon and tense naval standoffs in the Atlantic. The Cold War of our world is born here too, but it is a three-way freeze, a fascist empire dominating continental Europe, a diminished but defiant democratic power on its periphery, and a vast, secretive communist state in the east, all locked in a watchful, hateful equilibrium. The decades turn. The 1950s in Berlin are not a time of rubble and division, but of chilling, monumental grandeur. Albert Speer's plans for Germania, the world capital, begin to rise from the drawing boards. The broad north-south axis is carved through the city, not by bombs but by demolition crews and legions of slave labor. The great dome of the Volkshalle, large enough to enclose clouds, starts to shadow the city. The architecture is meant to last 1,000 years, all cold marble, vast, inhuman scale, and oppressive order. It is a beauty devoid of warmth, like moonlight on a glacier. Culture is sterilized, a state-approved aesthetic of heroic realism and folk nostalgia, while underground, in smoky jazz cellars and hidden attic rooms, Forbidden thoughts are exchanged in whispers, like seeds buried under permafrost. By the late 20th century, this world is profoundly different. Space exploration is not a peaceful competition for prestige, but a military frontier. The first man to orbit the Earth does so in a modified V-2 successor, wearing not a spacesuit, but the uniform of the Luftwaffe. Satellites watch not for weather, but for missile launches. The Internet, when it emerges, is a tightly controlled network for state and military communication, a tool of surveillance, not of connection. Travel across borders is a privilege for the elite of the Nazi Party and its client states. For most, Europe is a vast, beautiful prison. Resistance exists, but it is the work of generations, patient and quiet, expressed in hidden libraries, in folk songs with double meanings, in the careful preservation of languages and memories the state seeks to erase. And in the East, the Soviet Union, never forged in the patriotic fire of the Great Patriotic War, remains a brittle, paranoid gerontocracy. Its economy, inefficient and plagued by corruption, stagnates. Without the unifying myth of victory over fascism, the legitimacy of the state rests solely on fear and the memory of older revolutions. It is a sleeping bear, poorly fed and irritable, watching its Western neighbor with ancient, suspicious eyes. The tide of history, deflected from its course in 1941, flows into a deep, stagnant sea. The vibrant, messy, conflicted, but ultimately hopeful post-war order we know, the United Nations, the European project of reconciliation, the slow expansion of human rights, never germinates. Instead, the 20th century ends not with the fall of a wall, but with the silent, unceasing maintenance of many walls. The world is quieter, perhaps, absent the cacophony of our many liberation struggles, but it is a silence born of suppression, not contentment. The pages of history turned slowly after that summer of 1941, but they turned towards a darker, harder chapter, one written in steel and concrete, where the soft wind of change is felt only in the deepest, most hidden places of the human spirit. Thank you for exploring this alternate history with us. Anya's footsteps on the cobblestones of Posen were a soft, solitary rhythm. Each morning she walked the same route, past the skeletal remains of a church that was being methodically dismantled, stone by stone, to make way for a new Gao administration building. The air in this spring of 1943 carried not the scent of blossoms but of wet concrete and coal dust. Her world was defined by files and ledgers, a universe contained within the green felt of her office desk. She typed manifests for train cars, not of soldiers but of linen, leather and lumber, all stamped with the eagle and swastika, all sourced from the territories under administration. She knew, without allowing the knowledge to fully form, what that phrase meant. The ghetto in Łódź was now called Litzmannstadt, and its workshops produced a significant portion of the textiles she logged. The numbers of workers, meticulously reported, declined by a predictable percentage each quarter. Natural wastage, the reports said. The phrase had the same sterile weight as the office air. Her superior, Obersekretär Drexler, was a man of exacting routine. He smelled of peppermint and cheap cologne, and he examined each document with a magnifying glass, not for errors of fact, but for errors of form. A misaligned margin, a smudged stamp, could elicit a sigh of profound disappointment, as if Anya had offended a fundamental law of the universe. The violence here was in the omission, in the blank spaces on forms where the names of the deported used to be. It was in the calm, bureaucratic language that described quotas and resettlements. Some nights, lying in her narrow bed in the small room she rented from a widow who never met her eyes, Anya would imagine the ledgers catching fire, the neat columns of numbers curling into black ash. But the next morning she would return, her hands steady on the keys, her mind a careful blank. Survival was a kind of forgetting, a narrowing of focus to the immediate task. To look up, to see the horizon, was to drown in despair. Beyond her window, the new order was rising. On her Sunday walks, permitted, but always within designated zones, she would see the progress on the Reichsuniversität Posen. It was a massive, limestone block structure, all sharp angles and empty plinths waiting for statues of Germanic heroes. The scale of it was meant to awe, and it did, but with a cold that seeped into the bones. It spoke of a future that was immutable, a 1,000-year Reich not as propaganda, but as a coming fact. The students who would someday walk its halls were here already, boys in crisp Hitler-Jugend uniforms, their laughter strangely uniform, like birds from a single cage. The war, or what passed for it, felt distant. Sometimes, at night, a deep rolling thunder would echo from the west, carried on the wind. Not the erratic fury of a bombing raid, but something more systematic, more tectonic. It was the sound of the Atlantic Wall being fortified, an endless process of reinforcement. The radio in the widow's parlor spoke of impregnable defenses and the enduring peace of the continent. It spoke of terror attacks by British commandos on the Norwegian coast, always swiftly and brutally repelled. The news was a lullaby of grim stability. There were no stunning reversals, no miraculous stands, just the slow, relentless tightening of a grip. One afternoon, a new kind of document crossed Anya's desk. It was a logistics request from the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Ordnance Office, for priority rail transport to a facility in Peenemünde. The materials listed were cryptic: liquid oxygen, alcohol in unprecedented quantities, specialized alloys. Attached was a memo, stamped G.E. Heime Riksasche, that her security clearance, a mere formality for her lowly position, did not technically permit her to see. But Drexler was at a meeting, and the file lay open. One phrase leaped out: A4 Serienproduktion, Phase 3. She had heard whispers of the Vergeltungswaffe, the retaliation weapons. This was no whisper, it was a blueprint for a permanent rain of fire. She closed the file, her fingers cold. The evil she documented was no longer just in the slow suffocation of populations, it was in the cold engineering of a terror that could leap across seas, making the fortress not just defensive, but aggressively, eternally dominant. That evening, the walk home felt different. The monumental buildings seemed to lean inward, their shadows longer. She passed a newsstand, its placards announcing the latest success of the Luftwaffe's new Stormbirds, the jets she had heard about in fragments of conversation. They had intercepted and destroyed a squadron of British reconnaissance planes over the Baltic with ease. The vendor, an old man with a hollow face, caught her looking. For a fraction of a second their eyes met. In his there was no hope, no conspiracy, only a bottomless, weary recognition. It was the look of someone watching the tide come in, knowing his patch of sand was next. He looked away first, and the moment shattered. But something had shifted in Anya. The careful blankness she cultivated had developed a crack. In this world, resistance was not a matter of dramatic sabotage or clandestine radio broadcasts. Those happened, of course, and their perpetrators died screaming in the cellars of the Gestapo headquarters on Mullingse Street. True resistance was suppler, a spiritual attrition. It was the Polish widow who, when she thought no one was listening, hummed a Chopin prelude her mother had taught her. It was the railway worker who, by a mistake in switching, delayed a munitions train for 6 hours. It was in the way Anya that night took out a small notebook she had not touched in months. She did not write of rebellion or secret plans. She wrote in Polish, a language now forbidden in official life. She described the taste of the thin potato soup from the canteen, the sound of the widow's humming, the exact awful shade of the regime's flag against the limestone university. She wrote the names of her parents, her brother, their fates unknown but not unguessable. It was not a journal of defiance, but one of witness, a tiny, fragile assertion that this reality, for all its crushing permanence, was seen, was remembered by a human heart, and was found wanting. Far to the west, in a coastal village in Normandy, another kind of permanence was setting. The bunkers were not the hurried, slab-sided boxes of 1944, but vast, integrated complexes carved into the cliffs, connected by tunnels lined with ceramic tiles. Soldiers of the Wehrmacht, many of them now career professionals in a military that saw no end to its service, manned radar arrays that swept the English Channel with ceaseless electronic eyes. The sea breeze carried the smell of salt and diesel, but also of fresh paint and baking bread from the garrison kitchens. This was not a front line, it was a border. The enemy was not an invading army, but the gray horizon. For the young men stationed here, the war was a paradox. They had the best rations, regular leave rotations, and a deep, if grim, pride in their unassailable position. Yet a strange ennui could set in during the long watches. They were the guardians of a peace that was indistinguishable from siege. Some wrote letters home speaking of the breathtaking sunsets over the Atlantic, carefully omitting the fact that they watched those sunsets from behind 3 meters of reinforced concrete, their fingers resting on the triggers of guns that had never fired in anger. They were the soldiers of a victory that had frozen, leaving them perpetually poised for a battle that might never come, in a war that had no end. And in the silent east, along the Bug River, the watchtowers stood like stark trees in a dead forest. The Soviet sentry, even, smoked a hand-rolled cigarette, his breath pluming in the cold air. He could see the German sentry, a dark shape against the snow, doing the same. For 3 years they had shared this stretch of river, this silence. Sometimes in a bizarre, unspoken ritual, they would even wave, a tiny, futile gesture of human contact, across an ideological abyss. No shots were ever fired. The real enemy, even knew, was not the man in the field gray coat across the water. It was the political officer back at the barracks, the one who scrutinized their loyalty, who reminded them that the fascists were merely biding their time. But as the years passed, the urgency of that warning faded. The threat became atmospheric, a permanent low pressure, not a coming storm. The Red Army drilled and drilled again, but its doctrines were theoretical, its equipment untested in the crucible of total war. A deep institutional rot, the kind that comes from absolute power and absolute paranoia, worked its way through the ranks. Initiative was stifled, innovation viewed with suspicion. The Soviet Union was a locked room, and the air was growing stale. By 1950, the world map had solidified into its new, dreadful shape. Festung Europa was a fact. The Atlantic Wall was complete, a continuous spine of fortifications from the Arctic Circle to the Spanish border. The Mediterranean was a mare nostrum for the Axis, its southern shore controlled by a collaborationist French regime in North Africa, and a fascist Italy that had never known defeat. Britain was a husk of its former self, a nation under perpetual, if reduced, siege. The aerial blockade meant that only the most essential convoys, protected by the combined might of the US and Royal Navies, made it through. London was a city of perpetual twilight, its grand buildings soot-blackened skeletons, its people gaunt and resilient, in a way that spoke of decades, not years, of endurance. The King's speech on the radio each Christmas was a touchstone of continuity, but the hope of liberation had been replaced by the grim resolve of mere persistence. In Berlin, the heart of the New World beat with a slow, imperial rhythm. The Volkshalle was under construction. To see it, one had to navigate a canyon of scaffolding and cranes that blotted out the sky. The scale was beyond human comprehension. The interior, it was said, would hold 180,000 people under a dome so vast that internal weather systems, clouds, even light rain might form beneath it. Speer's vision was becoming stone and steel. The broad avenues designed for monumental parades were already in use, echoing with the synchronized tramp of boots on national holidays. The city felt less like a capital and more like a temple to a dead god, a god of power, order, and racial destiny. The vibrant, intellectual, artistic Berlin of the Weimar era was not just gone. It was archaeologically erased, buried under layers of granite ideology. Culture in this empire was a curated garden, every plant labeled and every weed exterminated. Cinema produced epic sagas of Teutonic knights and frontier farmers taming the eastern wilderness. Music was either the bombastic works of approved composers or sanitized folk tunes. Yet in the cracks, life persisted. In basement bars in the less reconstructed sectors of Hamburg or Leipzig, one could sometimes hear the wail of a saxophone, a sound deemed degenerate. The records were bootlegged, smuggled from neutral Switzerland, or even, daringly, from America. The music was played softly, and the patrons listened with an intensity that was about more than melody. It was a taste of air from outside the prison. Anya, now in her 30s, still worked in an office, though it had moved to a newer, more efficient building. She had become a ghost in the machine, so efficient and unobtrusive that she was almost invisible. This invisibility was her armor. She had married, quietly, to a Czech clerk named Tomas, another auxiliary personnel. Their love was a quiet, furtive thing, a shared warmth in a cold flat, a language of glances and pressed hands. They had a daughter, Kaisia, who was 6. This was Anya's deepest terror and her fiercest rebellion. Kaisia was being educated in a Reichsschule. She sang German songs, learned German history, and spoke Polish only in the hidden safety of their home, as a secret language between mother and daughter. Anya lived a double life, tending the fragile flame of a memory Kaisia never had. Each night, after Kaisia was asleep, Anya would take out her notebook, now several volumes thick. She wrote in Polish, detailing the world as it was, the slogans on the walls, the lessons in the school books, the empty look in the eyes of the old people in the market. She was writing a history for a future she might never see, for a daughter who might never understand it. It was her only form of prayer. The technological horizon of this world was both advanced and stunted. By 1955, a German rocket, an advanced descendant of the A4, had placed a small, polished steel sphere into orbit. It carried no scientific instruments, only a radio beacon that pulsed a monotonous pattern, the opening bars of the Horst Wessel Lied. It was a statement, not of exploration, but of dominion. The heavens, too, were now part of the Reich's domain. In hidden valleys in the Harz Mountains, other research continued, behind fences charged with electricity and guarded by soldiers from the SS Wissenschaftsbrigade. The atomic problem consumed mountains of resources and thousands of slave laborers. Progress was slow, mired in ideological squabbles and the sheer, horrifying complexity of the task. But it was relentless. The goal was not a deterrent, but the ultimate guarantor of the 1,000-year peace. And in the vastness of Russia, the silence grew heavier. Stalin was dead, succeeded by a committee of grim, suspicious men. The Soviet economy, never forced to adapt or innovate under the extreme pressure of war, lumbered on. It produced immense quantities of poor-quality steel, clunky machinery, and a deep, pervasive cynicism among its people. The Great Patriotic War was a ghost that never materialized, so the state's legitimacy rested on the fading memory of the revolution and the ever-present fear of the NKVD's successor. The border with the Reich was the most heavily fortified line on Earth, a double scar across the face of Europe, but it saw less traffic than a country lane. The two empires, one dynamic and cruel, the other stagnant and cruel, glowered at each other across a no-man's land that had reverted to wilderness, where wolves now dug in the places where minefields had long ago settled into the earth. As the 20th century entered its final quarter, the world was locked in a terrible equilibrium. There were no hot wars, only a perpetual global winter of the spirit. The idea of human rights was a quaint academic notion discussed in the few remaining universities of neutral Sweden or the exiled circles in London. The European project was not one of unity, but of homogenization under the jackboot. Travel was for the Reichsbahn's elite express trains, whisking party functionaries from Berlin to Paris or Rome. For the vast majority, the borders were as impassable as cliffs. Anya was an old woman now, her hair white, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of typing. Thomas was gone, taken by one of the pneumonias that swept through their underheated district. Kasia was a mother herself, her children fully German in speech and thought. though Anya sometimes caught a flicker of something else in her granddaughter's eyes, a curiosity, a question she dared not voice. The notebooks, dozens of them, were hidden in a false compartment behind the kitchen stove, a secret history in a world that had outlawed memory. One afternoon, a rare beam of sunlight fell through the window of her small apartment. It caught the dust motes, making them swirl like tiny galaxies. Outside, the loudspeakers on the corner were broadcasting a speech by the latest Führer, a man whose name Anya could never bother to remember. The voice was a familiar, angry drone. She ignored it. She looked at the sunbeam, at the way it warmed the worn wood of the table. She thought of the scent of the pine forests near her childhood home, a smell she had not encountered in 60 years. She thought of her mother's voice, singing a lullaby in Polish. In that moment, she felt not despair, but a quiet, unshakable certainty. They had taken everything, her home, her language, her future. They had built a world of steel and stone, and lies meant to last a millennium. But they could not take this, the memory of a sunbeam, the ghost of a scent, the love for a child. They could not control the silent, inward space where she remained irrevocably Anya. The regime's time was counted in years, in monuments, in the lifespans of dictators. Hers was counted in these moments of stolen, defiant remembrance. The walls they had built were vast, but the human spirit was a seed carried on a soft wind, and it needed only the tiniest crack in the concrete to dream of spring. The world was quiet, but in that silence, if one listened very closely, one could still hear the faint, persistent whisper of another possibility buried deep